everyone. Thank you for your patience as we have super exciting fun with technology today. It is the nature of these things. So, I've been taking to recapping a little bit of class at the top of these streams just to set the stage. This week is Yazeba's week here in the actual play slash TTRPG class. This is the first experience where the class played a game and then watched, or in this case, listened to an actual play. I discussed on Tuesday how the Yazeba playthrough went, and we kind of circled back to those responses now that they've had a little bit of a cooling off period. And we talked a little bit about the friction, and I was able to bring Jade Dragon's voice into that conversation by noting the ways in which the friction of Yazeba's, the ways in which it is a little uncomfortable to folks to experience a game that doesn't penalize failure, it rewards failure, and that basically says there are no rules that you can't throw out if you need to. So, we talked a little bit about failing forward styles of mechanics, and I encouraged them as we move towards next week's adoption of tabletop role playing games of for students to think about whether that's an exciting kind of mechanic that they'd like to be exploring further. What do they feel like about failure? And I gave them two examples of my favorite kind of classic examples of games where failure is baked in, it is inevitable. And that is Stephen Dewey's 10 Candles, where, surprise, you're all going to die. The important part is not avoiding death, but what do you do with the time that you as player know your character has left. I also referred to dread that works somewhat in the same kind of way. That Jenga tower is going to fall at some point, and that's almost one of the pleasures of the game. So, planting seeds in that kind of way, we then transitioned into first impressions of actual play. And this is where there has been a lot of friction in the past two iterations of the tabletop role playing class. Actual play can be a pretty heavy lift to those who are not familiar with it. This time, we've got some critters in the room, so asking them to listen to something for an hour and 15 minutes is basically like asking them to do almost nothing at all. In addition, starting with an audio podcast frees up the different ways in which they can experience it. And one of the things I asked them to do was to make a note of the embodied situation in which they were listening. The only rule that I said was try not to do any multitasking in terms of hardcore reading or writing tasks. If they had filing to do, or laundry, or cooking, or chill time, or driving, those are all very common ways that people consume an actual play while doing something else. I did also suggest that they not listen before bedtime lest they have weird dreams, and at least two students kind of listened in the middle of naps and things like that and reported how that went. One student even experienced the two halves of the Yazeba's actual play by Jeff Stormer and Possum Creek as two different experiences, one near the end of a very long day, and the second half right before class when there's much more energy. They were listening to the episode that is A Birthday for Gertrude, and so that also is kind of an interesting experience of the changing energy levels of that particular chapter in the game. So all told, it was a really surprisingly frictionless initial discussion about actual play. And I think that's because I didn't throw them into the deep end with kind of some of the biggest, longest examples of the form. I've also given them notice that as a birthday gift from me to them, they will all have access to Dropout for the period of this class. That is something that I am investing in with my own funds, not the universities, because I believe in Dropout and want to support them, especially given that they had to go dark kind of for a few critical weeks. As they were kind of figuring out where they fit in relationship to the SAG-AFTRA strike that is ongoing. So a modest expense in the grand scheme of things to make a potential impact in the students' experiences. I may not have to pay for all those subscriptions because some of them are already Dropout and Dimension 20 fans. So it's a small class. This class currently has a class size of 13. It caps at 15. And that's basically, we have settled down, like there are no new potential enrollments at this point. So we're now starting to kind of doing the process of building from here on out. So the final third of class, after we talked about what actual play is, the experience that newbies had, other experiences that people bring into the space, the Adventure Zone continues to be a big touchstone for the students who are familiar with actual play. Some folks who are familiar with different perspectives of Critical Role and Dimension 20, but the Adventure Zone is still like far and away the biggie, and I'm not entirely sure how to tell the story of why that is, but there we go. We will also be talking more about, and they will have more chance to take a look at other actual plays as we consider also the finalists for New Jersey Web Fest, of which I am a judge. So they'll be dipping in as part of their contracted work into different actual plays as their interest takes them. But the key assignment that's before they start writing that contract is the selection of tabletop role-playing games. There's a master list of 149 thanks to my initial things I own or wish I owned, things recommended by my colleague, the great historian Evan Torner, and then all of social media that threw a whole bunch more titles at me. So there's a master list that files that I have legally acquired either by personal gift from the designers or from my own purchase go into a locked access point that students can take a look at. And so they know that those are in perusal. And then anything that was recommended but that I do not currently own, I put a link to DriveThruRPG or itch.io or the designer's website so that the students could navigate to something that would tell them about the game. If they get excited about the game, I will purchase it, put the PDF into our perusal ecosystem for them to consult. I also encourage students who really fall in love with a game to purchase their own copy where possible. For some out-of-print examples, physical copies are no longer possible, so that's not always easy. So far, we have 2 students who have been debating over who's going to get to call dibsies on Call of Cthulhu. We have 2 students who are duking it out over Tim Hutchings' 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. I think one of them is going to actually go to Xing Kor's Amending, which I'm very excited about. Xing will be joining us at Auburn, courtesy of the art department. I had nothing to do with this aside from, helping facilitate the connection. But that's a very exciting development that's coming to Auburn in the spring. But for most students, they're still kind of looking at all the choices on the, grocery store shelf. So what's required of them by Tuesday is either a top 3 or a set of keywords or key mechanics or vibes that they're looking to be matched with. I have one student who's very excited about Betrayal on House on the Hill. And that's a great legacy board game that has some connections to tabletop role playing games, but is not, strictly speaking, a tabletop role playing game in the same way. So I said, your task for the reflection post is to say what it is about Betrayal that you're really excited about. I also encourage you to go explore, kind of, look inside the games that are marked horror and see, what kind of horror are you excited about? Or is it that you're excited about ghosts or something else? So that's the kind of conversation we started having and we will continue to have on Tuesday. The idea will be that I will bring in as many of the books behind me as I get a sense that students are either directly interested in or that seem kind of in conversation with games that they're expressing an interest in. And so what we'll do is we'll then do the kind of negotiation of there's only one person can tackle each of the tabletop games. We'll make sure everybody's situated, and then we'll take the games that they didn't pick, be it physical or on perusal, and we'll start to ask some questions. And the first question that we're going to ask, the first question that students are reading their way into over the weekend is, what is a tabletop role-playing game? And we're starting with the definition provided, or definitions provided by Gabe Hicks in A Kid's Guide to Tabletop Role-Playing Games, although they also have links to several pieces from Analog Game Studies and other scholars that allow them to see kind of other examples or the history of definitional kind of back and forth. There's also a master list from Gnome Stew of literally copy pasta of different definitions of what is a role-playing game. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll use the ones that they're not kind of adopting and take as our kind of central method of discussion. Okay, so where do we find it? What happens if we don't find it? Because what's going to be very true as we continue to ask questions of these very different tabletop games, because we're going to try to have as many different kind of traditions, different kinds of mechanics, different kinds of vibes represented across the 13 students. And so some of those games do not include some things that I'm going to ask them to look for. And so we're going to also start to have the conversation of what does it mean to talk about an absence in the text? Are there ways of us seeing vestigial traces of an idea versus, a game that is ignoring safety tools, even though it was produced in a time when many games are creating safety tools, right? Or an earlier game might not use the word safety tool or any of the kind of recognizable safety tools that we're familiar with, but is doing something along those lines. Similarly, in terms of character, some games that we play have predetermined characters or character builds. And then there are other games, and we're going to come across the quiet year in year 5, that you're not playing characters. So so my pedagogical structure here is to look ahead to what's coming, kind of signpost again and again, right? This is what's coming. This is who's coming. This is the questions that you will be asked and that you can ask. As we spend this first week just calibrating, like having a first experience of a slightly more robust role-playing game, experiencing what that performed game is like, talking to them a little bit about the kind of wide variety. There are games that are very close to audiobooks. As one student noted, this felt very familiar to them from audio fiction that they've consumed before. And then there's, on the other end, a kind of deep interest in not editing, having pure play experiences, being, I said the crunch of every Cheeto in class. And that most actual plays operate somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but that because we have both folks who are coming into this kind of practice of actual play from live play or let's play, like playing video games on YouTube or Twitch, that brings with its own kind of vocabulary and rhythm and expectation. And on the other end, we have podcasters like Jeff Stormer and like I invoked Dark Dice in this respect, who are audio fiction folks who then turn to actual play as a parallel or complementary practice in their portfolio of creative work. And this is where I introduced the idea that we're going to be working with throughout the semester of the actual play field. In other words, many people talk about actual play as a industry or as a community. And then increasingly we are coming to the realization that it is both and neither, but that there's maybe an umbrella term that we need. And so lots of people have started to use space. I have used space. But there is a notion that comes from Pierre Bourdieu's kind of work on kind of power and culture making, and specifically kind of the production of cultural value, where we can talk about the field of cultural production. And Brendan Keogh has used this in his amazing book, The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist. And his argument is not that the video game industry does not exist, but rather that the video game industry, the AAA Call of Duty making, part of what it is to make video games, is one small part. And there's a huge number of game makers who are interacting and connected to that kind of core in different sorts of ways, be it in terms of creative influence or communities or just, the tools that they use or the education they've gone through. And so that we have to understand the field better, and that the industry is one part, one position or set of positions within the larger field. There's also educational positions. There's positions of kind of radical anti-capitalist. I do not sell my work. I do it. There's lots of different positions within the field that have that take different positions in relationship to these kinds of issues of money and identity with job and all those sorts of things. This is also true of tabletop, and this is also true of actual play. And what's exciting, especially about actual play, because it's a fairly young form, we can talk about the digital turn taking place in the last 15-ish years. We can talk about it really blowing up within the last decade, and we can talk about it being monetized and professionalized, whatever the hell that means, in the last 5-ish, right? And so, but this is still a field that is trying to define itself. And the way that a field of cultural production, as I said to students today, defines itself is by making collective assertions about value that have nothing to do with monetization. So, the minute that the field talks about things of value that cannot be translated immediately into capital, in other words, we're not talking about subs, we're not talking about followers, we're not talking about money, we're not talking about sponsors. But once we're starting to talk about something else and figure out ways of signaling that recognition, and that means things like awards and reviews and peer recognition of all kinds. Once you're talking about that, congratulations, you're a mature field of cultural production. And that's where we are now. The Crit Awards, whatever you think about the Crit Awards, and reasonable people, have different thoughts about what awards mean in general. But the fact that the Crit Awards exist is a sign that this field of cultural production has decided that it wants to imagine differently than just money, which is a lovely thing, right? And it should be noted, is never actually entirely disconnected from other forms of power. Everything in any given field of cultural production both touches on other fields, and this field is very much kind of intersected and overlapped with the values and people of different other fields: TV, film, podcasting, game design. All of those values kind of leak into this emergent field. And over all of it is the field of power, the field of money. Um, so I kept doing this in class to kind of imagine the drawdown of a field, kind of saying, oh no, I don't want to value by those values of capital and power, but instead I want to pull this down into something else meaningful. So we started to plant the seeds of that, and they're going to hear me kind of rant on these subjects for a good long time to come. So that's the recap. And for my students who were not able to join us in class today, you can end here. But there are people in the chat, and I would love to have your questions about, I always say problems, curiosities, uh, points of information I can provide in terms of the class. This is your time. So we'll see if anything emerges. In the meantime, it's my birthday, and it's been a pretty good one. One of the interesting things about this class is that it's an active learning classroom. I was one of the first 7 faculty to pilot these over a decade ago, before we built the beautiful new classroom building that I currently teach in. And one of the nice things is it's a bunch of modular tables and chairs that can move around. And so sometimes they're in little pods, and you can turn them, as we did today, into a kind of discussion circle. And we're having some interesting moments of friction between my class and the next class about what are the rules about leaving chairs behind. Or what configuration do we have to leave them in? What's the expectation? Um, that's fun. Uh, Also, this is the second week of class, so it's the week that everybody starts getting parking tickets and finds out if they've paid their campus parking permit. Because of course we don't have free parking here at Auburn. Everybody's paying for the ability to put their car uh, on a thing. So, yeah. Sorry, Matthew. Yazeba's recap. Basically, I mean, it went super well, and I'm happy to answer specific questions. Um, Basically, just to kind of recap, because the audio was kind of garbage on Tuesday. Thanks, John Boltana, for letting me know. But I selected 4 of the early chapters, and we had 3 groups, and they played those chapters. And so it ended up being the eerie mood basement one, the frantic mood of the brunch making, and the contemplative firefly move. Uh, so yeah. And then we listened to Yazeba's, and also I can say my first dungeon is also putting out on September 15th a their mini series of Yazebas, which I am in as Amelie. And so we talked a little bit about my own field work kind of in passing. So stay tuned for that. I've never heard my voice in robot form before, until I heard the final cut for the game. Esther, thank you so much, and thank you for the happy birthday wishes. I appreciate it. Um, so the question, just in case I've messed up YouTube questions, how can folks who are active in the field support the field becoming more mature? What kinds of initiatives can we create and support? No, I think that's a really good question. And I think that things like awards are important in those kinds of ways of signaling are important. Reviewing is also important. I wish I am able to pitch to Polygon to the extent that my own time allows, as well as just the freelancers cost money, right? So it has to be worth it in terms of the SEO. So anything that's marked reviews in terms of actual play, if you can just vote with your eyeballs that that's content you want to see, because reviews are a kind of form of labor that, if we're doing them right, and I hope I'm doing them right, are signaling or starting a conversation about what is it that we're seeing happening in the form and what do we want to see more of. What I wish from, and this is like a note to myself as someone who is participating in the judging of the New Jersey Web Fest. So this is like not just like externalized, but something I'm thinking about is we need to figure out what do we mean when we want to give an award. What are the signifiers or what are the values that we're trying to communicate when we say something is the best show of a form? What are the signs of that? And I don't have good answers for any of that. Like, that's one of the things that I was confronted with while I was listening to things, was like, how do I decide what's good editing? How do I know what's good editing as in when I'm listening to the final product? How do I know what goes into a good overlay, and how do we want to judge that as a document design? You know, what does it mean? I've been asking for a year and a half what makes a good player, and I think I understand what makes a good player, but how do we see it in again, in the final product? Which I think is really, these are hard questions, and questions that I'm hoping, this is why I'm really excited about Big Bad Con, because I think that that's a space where we can start to have those kinds of questions. And I love those kinds of questions. Um, uh, yeah, Matthew, I will say, in terms of Yazebas for different groups, this is my first time in the classroom, but I've run it for lots of different kinds of groups of friends and scholars over the last little while. There's always a little bit of friction when it comes to actually, like, basically there's two kinds of friction. There's the newbie friction, and then there's the like hardcore gamer friction, and it's basically the handshaking meme of both of them are like, wait, but what are the rules that I have to follow? Jay Dragon has noted there's going to be a quick start guide in the kind of box version of Yazebas, and I'm going to be very curious to see if my students think that that's the quick start they wish they had. I've offered that to them as an essay possibility if they want to make their own like guide to how to introduce Yazebas. Um, yeah, Esther, I think this is, you know, all of these awards are fairly new, and we're trying to figure out, we all come from the same good place, right? We want to acknowledge this as an art form, um, but we also come from very different kinds of traditions of understanding that art form and the art forms that are connected to it. That's why I'm so excited about this moment, right? Because this is when we start to have this conversation. And spoiler alert for Big Bad Con, and I will do like a kind of recap of what I say at Big Bad Con, although we are not going to record that for the very good reason of, I think that that's got to be a safe space for asking hard questions. But one of the things I'm going to do is bring my 18th century hat and say, like, I'm an 18th century novel scholar. So let me tell you how a genre emerged, and all the marginalized people got erased from history because of not just sexism and racism, although of course it's British lit, so that's part of it, but also because of particular materialities and realities that maybe we can avoid. So basically, I'm looking ahead and trying to avoid what we call in 18th century novel studies the great forgetting. And so that's part of my sense of urgency in this form. Um, so yeah. Oh my God, 30 games of Yazebas at Gen Con. That's banana pants. And that this may be one of the first times that I've actually wished I could be at Gen Con to observe that happening. Because that's fascinating to me. And yeah, I mean, and I'm glad that it was an iterative process to figure it out. I'm also, we are days away from the first round of signups for Big Bad Con. And while I kind of really don't want to take away limited spaces seats from folks, like I feel very ambivalent about that given my own positionality. I'm deeply curious about how Jay runs a game of Yazeba's, so we'll see. Um, oh my god, double the game offerings. Yeah, no, I think Yazeba's once we have it in our physical hot little hands, like, the thing I'm really excited about is, like, hopefully next year, I get to teach Yazeba's again, and then I have the book, right? And maybe what we do is that book becomes the collective of every class I ever teach, right? And so that the stickers kind of grow year over year, so it becomes not the document of one play group, but many. I don't know. I'm a book historian, so I'm really excited about the bookishness of Yazeba's, which is something I don't think we've entirely experienced yet. But I'm also trying to think about my own personal copy and like whether I'm going to keep it pristine or whether I'm going to mess it up with my friends or whether I'm going to mess it up with my students. So these are the stupid problems that come from this. But of course, I'm reasonably certain that the high likelihood is because it's such a big game that and hopefully it will stay in print just as Wonder Home and others have, so that I think this deserves a place in our library. For example, uh, Evan Torner's much more purposeful in terms of building an institutional library of games, and of course, there are places like the Strong Museum of Play and the Duke Rubenstein Library Collection, and other places that are also keeping copies. But one of the tensions of the TTRPG class is the when is my material book the object that I, like, send a student home with in this act of trust versus when do I just say, "I should just buy another copy of Amending," and, like, hand that to the student? Um, the physicality. I mean, it's funny because this is such a class that is dependent on PDFs, right? It's deeply invested, and of course, like so many games, so many awesome games, especially itch.io games, really only exist in a PDF form or a print and play version, or have existed for kind of a heartbeat in its physical instantiation, and now it continues to exist thanks to PDFs. But there is the part of me that before this, I was co-teaching classes on the history of the book in theory and practice, that where what we were talking about and what we were doing was we were learning how to describe in very technical language how old books were made, and like looking at old books and kind of building what are called collational formulas to describe how they're built, and how this one copy is different from all the other copies. And then they would go make books themselves using the Adobe suite, using InDesign and things like that. Because I was co-teaching with a document designer, and I'm thinking a lot about the lessons learned in that class, especially now that this class has, I think, about good third of the class are document design students. And so they bring with that kind of understanding of layout and design and questions you ask about like physical layout style design challenges, not game design challenges. But of course, those two go together in such beautiful kinds of ways. Um, do people study marginalia in TTRPG texts? As far as I know, no one has yet. There is a great elsewhere on YouTube. If you look up Generation Analog, Analog Game Studies Journals annual virtual conference. This year, there was a talk about kind of what it would look like to collect legacy board games, either literally collecting the final board states of, say, like Pandemic Legacy, or figuring out a way to describe those kind of the way we do collational formulas to gather a bunch of data about final play states for a bunch of boards. And it was not a like, I'm doing this right now kind of question, but it was a kind of, as academics often do, is like thinking through like, what are the logistics? What could we glean? What kind of information matters? But my dream for Yazebas is that we do that kind of bibliographic examination. And I'd be very curious if there are other book games that lend themselves to that. Like, Thousand Year Old Vampire is a beautiful object, but it's not an object that that I think of as one that transforms in play in the way that Yazeba's does. Keepsake games, like what Shing does, are my obsession, right? And I'm trying to figure out a way. So, funny story. Shing is being brought by the art department for 2 weeks as a artist in residence for her puppetry work. And so we're, like, sliding a little, TTRPG nerding in, but, like, we have to be very respectful of the amount of labor we are asking her to do in any one of these kinds of permutations. But I'm so excited. I and my collaborator, Emily Kugler, who is the co-owner of Critical Prof as a channel, we were able to write an essay for Shing's new tarot deck and zine. Um, so it'll be nice to kind of meet a virtual, like, I think Jason Carl called us pen pals. That kind of weird virtual kind of, meeting, that then becomes instantiated in flesh, which is really lovely. But yeah, so there was a version of this class that, and I emailed, because I have a, like, I have a one-time, like, little fund of money that I can spend on stuff for the class, about, I think it's $2,500. Um, and so I seriously considered assigning amending to every student in the class, which, like, led to this really interesting email where I was like, "Can I do this? It's like $50 a piece. Is that okay?" And basically I was told, like, it's within the scope of the funding, like, it's hypothetically reusable, or most parts of it are, not a problem. Uh, but we are bringing folks over, like, we're not paying for a whole mess of plane tickets, for our visitors. We're mostly kind of folks who would already be down in Alabama or Georgia. We're basically saying, "Hey, we'll put you up in the hotel." But, like, that's all the copies of amending we would need for a full class is 3 nights we could be, entertaining someone down here, or maybe even more than that. So that has not happened, but I'm very excited that a student's gonna kind of adopt it, so I can kind of ask, like, "Tell me more. How much time did you spend? Like, how many hours did this, do you recommend that the whole class experience this? Or is it only working for you because you're already an embroidery nerd?" Technically, you don't need to sew that keepsake game. You can, like, sticker and color it up, but, there is something about the kind of tactility of needle and thread that, but these are the interesting questions that will come from working one-on-one with students about with these kinds of, putting out these little test balloons, which is very cool. Um, so yeah, so because this assignment basically, um, across the semester, once they've adopted the games that they're gonna adopt, they have to play them. If they want an A, they run the game 3 times outside of class. If they want a B, they only have to run it 2, and if they just wanna pass, then they have to run it once. If they're doing a journaling game that's complex, like Amending or Thousand Year Old Vampire, or something that takes a lot of durational time, um, you know, some of, um some of Jian Shim's games are really short experiences in those ways, and others, because it requires, like, you go find feathers, right? Then it's gonna take a whole lot longer. Um, but basically each game has a challenge rating, and, they can negotiate on those, but, the idea is I will then, for different days when we're doing discussion, say, "Okay, here's the situation with the state of indie. Here's what the Forge said about indie, and here's how people on Twitter talk about indie. And, here's the indie awards that, here's Indiecade, or, here's the Crit Awards, specifically indie categories, all those sorts of things. Is your game indie? Why do you say that? According to who? According to what metrics? And that's a question that they can ask of their own individual games. Um, you know, what mechanics does your game have? All games have mechanics, so and then how do we find those in the game state? And how do those mechanics, kind of lead to, along with, setting stuff and all that sort of thing, into a larger world? And what kind of logics? So Because there are people here and that's lovely. I'll give you kind of an example. So, uh, we will, on week 4, take a look at Candela Obscura's Quick Start Guide, which is about 20-ish pages, and the first 29 pages of Brindlewood Bay. Uh, 2 completely different, games in terms of system, but they are both ultimately mysteries. Um, and not just player feelings, Matthew, but what's really interesting in the conversation I had with folks over the summer, I was part of an academic group that came together. Some scholars, some people who are kind of crossover, some designers, other kinds of nerds, all together. And we would play a game for 2 hours and then we would sit and basically have a graduate seminar for 2 hours. Um, and when we talked about Brindlewood Bay, I love Brindlewood Bay because of the emergent narrative, right? Like, everyone has control and the dice tell the story to a certain extent. There's also a scenario in which if you collect enough clues, you can basically make it so that you don't have to roll. I That's every time I've played Brindlewood Bay, that is what players have done. Is what I've done as a player, right? And so then what that game becomes is, as someone said in this discussion, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist." Nice emphasis from my shaky camera. And you're always right. And what does it mean to build that kind of world where there's so much agency that I played a version of the game where, the materials in front of me were positing one kind of love triangle, but the successful solution posited a very different one. And that's fascinating to me. That's a lot of player control. And then the game master is, really the guide on the side, right? Not the sage on the stage, as we say in in like kind of teaching circles. And you compare that to what Candela is doing, which Candela is really interested in providing scenarios for fully realized and embodied characters to react to. And so that's much more of a kind of, you know, moving sidewalk. Not That's not a perfect metaphor, but it is giving much more control back to the DM to set the scenario, to set the scenes, to set the clues that propel from scene to scene, because it's presuming a player that's not interested in that part of the agency and much more interested in feeling like they're exploring a fully realized world and that their character is a fully realized creation that is kind of moving through it with their buddies or their enemies or some combination of the two. Neither of those is bad, but they're posit very different things about what you're discovering and how you're discovering it and how much you have and what kinds of control you as a player or you as a GM have, which I find really interesting. So we're going to have that conversation as like kind of two really interesting, fairly recent, well, one's not even out yet fully, so we can't say anything definitive about it. But very interesting examples of mechanics, right? Um, and they'll also watch the little 13-minute Crafting a Mystery with Matthew Mercer, as well as Matt Coville's video here on YouTube, about mechanics versus settings and styles of play, to kind of bring in that conversation. They also will have access, because I'm going to want them to make reference to it, to RPG Theory in Your House is a collection of mechanics in TTRPG. Mark Hines's piece on game mechanics and narrative is Symbiotic in Tombs of Annihilation, and as well Z Bashu's kind of little mini 6-7 minute video on Blades in the Dark's mechanics. Because the kind of I anticipate that there are going to be students who are both studying Blades and studying Call of Cthulhu. So they'll get to be the experts that day. And that's going to be what kicks off us thinking about um, this notion of mechanics are the thing that matter in a role playing game, or are a thing that matters. And they are the beating heart of what you can and cannot do and the possibilities that you can imagine, which is really lovely. And that's going to kick off what I think of as kind of the middle part. It's an interesting structure this semester because I'm so lucky because of Dragon Con. to have some guest visitors. Josh Simons is coming next Thursday. Ned Donovan is coming the Thursday after. So we're kind of slowly rolling into the adopt a TTRPG part, and not doing quite as much kind of immersive play from the jump. So week 5, we'll do the quiet year, and basically the idea is we're gonna play a ton in the middle, so that they have some time, especially those of us them who have adopted very large games, to both read and understand their games and start to schedule sessions for play. Students can get credit for playing in other people's games if they contract for it. Because as we all know, the hardest part of role playing games is finding a time to do it. So basically, I am saying we're playing some games inside of class in the middle of the semester precisely so that you don't have any prep to do aside from running your own games during those weeks. So then we'll do dialect. Thank God for Becca Scott's introduction to dialect, a really beautiful explainer. Carlos Luna also has one, but it's a little bit more geared to roll 20. Um, so it's not quite as suited for purpose. And then we'll go back to kind of representing the world. Esther very kindly is going to be our guest that week when I'm at Big Bad Con. We'll do a little, we'll have Esther and anybody else who wants to hang out, I guess, poolside, to talk to my students on Zoom before the con gets started. But they will have been thinking about games as metaphors, led by Shelley Jones's piece "Blinded by the Role: The Critical Fail of Disability in D&D," and Jen Kretschmer's "Accessibility and Gaming Resources." But the idea will be broader than that, to kind of think about central metaphors, kind of beyond that. I suspect by that point we will also probably end up being talking about Baldur's Gate 3, whether I like it or not. Um, After Big Bad Con, we'll spend the better part of the next 2 weeks playing Alice is Missing, which is a staple of this class because it plays really beautifully, and it's a beautiful experience. Um, at the end of that, you really only need 2 days to do it, but 3 days is best. It gives you a little bit more time to do the important debrief stuff. And then Gabe Hicks is going to come and we're going to talk about design stuff and performance stuff and all kinds of things. And then we'll come back to like those deep questions of interrogating our games, talking about genealogies, who made them, who were the publishers versus who were the creators. Is the game built on a system that was designed for another game, or has it in turn inspired other games? Is it part of an established IP? Are there other inspirations that the designers mention? That's the Thursday. We'll talk about indie. And then the next week, we will talk about awards. We will talk about actual play more specifically, where we will get into it. And then it's week 14, or it's week 12 through 14, and I can't tell you what's gonna happen because that's all student directed. They'll either ask for more guidance, more guided experiences, be those play or reading or research, or they'll work on essays, which are can look however they want them to look. It can be a new syllabus, it can be kind of remixing a game. It can be creating a new game. It can be a novel, not a novel, short story, poem, pantoum. I had a student do a diptych of paintings. Uh, all and the idea will be that if there isn't enough textual material to analyze, they'll have a critical introduction that explains and puts their work in conversation with what we've been thinking about the whole semester. And we'll present those in the last week right before Thanksgiving. We have this kind of weird vestigial week right after our week off for Thanksgiving. And that's a good time for Taylor Moore to be coming and rounding out the star-studded lineup, as well as our final day, which is going to be basically safety tools, not a coverage of safety tools, but using them, stars and wishes, more, better, different, so that they can kind of pay it forward to the next version of the class. Because every version of this class is informed by what the students say on that last day. And then their final exam is a metacognitive reflection, a thinking about their thinking, where they put it all together in a final letter to me. But the bulk of their work is done. Um, uh, yeah, uh, Only Play Wizards has not yet heard about, Baldur's Gate 3 from the students. That's shocking considering how many students you have. Um, and to be fair, I've still only heard it invoked once. Um, uh D&D movie has not yet been mentioned in class, which I think is really interesting. I got a lot of head nods about the Legend of Vox Machina, so I think there are some folks who have that as a touchstone. Um, Esther, thank you so much for coming with your really lovely questions. Matthew, thank you so much as well. We have been going for just about 50 minutes, but don't worry, we'll we'll have another office hour next week. And at that time, we will talk about how Gabe Hicks's Kids Guide to Tabletop Role Playing Games works out as a reading experience, as well as the final list of what games this group of students finalize and pick, as well as some of the ones that were the honorable mentions. So it'll be a celebration of nerdy ass role playing games as it always is. Um, Last note is the rules that the students have to follow are, as I mentioned, no two students can work on the same tabletop game. No student can select a game they have already played. Advanced game nerds can always request games that are not on my 149 game list. And I'm hoping that we ultimately end up with a belonging outside of belonging game, a powered by the apocalypse game, at least one horror system, a solo or duet game, and ideally a good mix of different publishers and generations. Yeah, and what they don't pick, I will just continue to bring in as examples, which is a lovely thing. Um, Also fascinating, final notes, that, so John's class is getting minimal critical role, more dimension 20. I'm seeing a lot of the adventure zone still, some dimension 20, some critical role. So we've got a fascinating we are still in a really interesting inflection point in terms of this why students are coming into the class and what they're bringing with them. It's still not an overwhelming majority of actual play nerds, but the ones that are committed, and that's what makes it super fun. So I'm going to go conk out until indeed Critical Role. But thank you guys so much for lovely questions and conversation. And we'll be right back at it with another office hour on Tuesday. Until then, thank you so much.